everyone, and welcome to God's Plan, Your Part, a podcast where our goal is to read the entire Bible in a year, seeking to understand God's plan of redemption while discovering daily and practically your part in it.
Welcome back to God's Plan, Your Part. Today we are looking at Luke 22 and John 13. We're kind of getting deeper and deeper into this story of Jesus getting closer and closer to his death and ultimately his resurrection. So today, what we're looking at is the wrap up of the Passover meal. There's a couple things that stick out to me that I want to talk about today. The first thing is this foot washing thing that is just recorded in John 13. Luke alludes to it a little bit because Luke talks about kind of the inciting incident, but it's John where we get a lot of information. So Jesus is sitting at the table, and we talked about this the other day. Jesus is sitting at the table announcing this new covenant. So he hands out, he's leading the Passover meal, which has a lot of symbolism in it, but he hands out the bread and tells the disciples that this is his body broken for them, which is not a part of the Passover feast. And then he passes this cup around, and he says, this is my blood and the covenant of my blood poured out and shed for you, which is also not part of the Passover feast. So Jesus is doing a couple things that are not normal, and a couple of things that they have never experienced before, because Jesus is literally proclaiming that the new covenant is here. It's arrived in the shedding of Jesus' blood, and we now have interaction with God, relationship with God in a new way through that covenant. But it's also at this meal that apparently a little bit of a debate, a little bit of an argument, a little bit of a fight breaks out, and we can read about that in the Luke passage. And then we can see that the John passage kind of explains Jesus' reaction to it. So at one point during the dinner, I would guess towards the end of the dinner, the disciples start to argue with each other about who is the best and who is the greatest. And it's almost universal that whenever the disciples get in a fight about who is the greatest, it's right after Jesus has alluded to the fact that he will be leaving. And I guess it's sort of frustrating. You can be disappointed pretty easily in the disciples, but you can also be, happy that the disciples are very similar to us, because I can see humanity falling into these same kind of squabbles all the time. Jesus is literally talking about how he's going to be leaving soon, and I think the natural reaction of the disciples is, well, then who's going to lead us? And it seems like there's a couple of them that are eager to proclaim that they will lead each other, because the debate becomes who is the best and who is the greatest. We've seen this before. James and John were asking for special seats. There's been another time as they were walking along the road as Jesus is doing his ministry, that they've been debating who is the best. And always Jesus responds by encouraging them to be servants. He tells them whoever is going to be the most should be the least. Whoever is going to be the greatest should be a servant. And so it's kind of this upside down kingdom view of things. But I really like John 13. I think John 13 is really powerful, because here Jesus doesn't just tell them what to do, he shows them what to do. So in the midst of their arguing about who's going to be the best, Jesus actually takes off his outer garment. That's not any kind of weird thing. He takes off his outer garment and uses it as a towel to clean the disciples' feet. If you're not aware of this, you haven't heard this story very often, it would have been normal for houses to have servants whose jobs were to wash feet, because your primary mode of transportation is walking. It's dusty, it's dirty, people's feet get dirty. You don't want that all around the house. So oftentimes, someone would be tasked with washing feet. And obviously, it would not be someone who is really influential. It would be somebody who's serving. So Jesus' response to this argument about who's going to be the best and who's going to be the greatest is to actually take on the role of a servant. And this is easy to read about, but if you imagine having a dinner with a group of your friends, or maybe you have a dinner with, whoever, you have a dinner with several people, if somebody were to stand up and take off their outer garments and start washing people's feet at the table, it'd be pretty awkward. It'd be pretty strange. And this is exactly what happens. It gets the disciples' attention. And Peter is the one who says, absolutely not, you're not going to wash me. And Jesus says, if I don't wash you, you won't be in relationship with me. He says, well, then wash all of me. And so Peter is, in typical fashion, just kind of the overachiever. He, first of all, doesn't want anything to do with Jesus, and then he wants Jesus to go over and above for him. I think the reason that this is so interesting to me is because I actually grew up doing this. I grew up in the Mennonite church. I still really appreciate a lot of things about the Mennonite church, but one of the things that we practice, just like we would practice communion, we would practice foot washing, I guess, as a kind of sacrament. We would do it on a schedule. And it's just like this. I mean, you have like tubs of water, and the men would go to one place and the women would go to another place, obviously in good old fashioned Mennonite fashion. And the men would wash feet and the women would wash feet, and lots of people thought it was weird. Lots of people would just happen to disappear right before the foot washing time. But it's always really meaningful. And I think the reason I bring it up is it's kind of silly. I don't think Jesus meant that this was supposed to be a church sacrament. I don't think he meant that we should do this in remembrance of him, quite like he did with communion. But we would practice this. And what's interesting is you'd have really meaningful interactions. I mean, if you think of your church, if it was part of your church culture to wash feet once a year or twice a year or 3 times a year, or whatever, it's very likely you would have meaningful interactions with people. A lot of times we would be worshiping together. We would be encouraging each other. Oftentimes it was like very multi-generational. There'd be young guys sitting with old guys. You'd be interacting with people you don't normally interact with. And it was really valuable. But one of the things I would always notice that stuck out to me, was kind of funny to me. One, people that thought it was awkward would sneak away. They would just, kind of feel it coming in the service and just leave. And that's not a wrong thing per se, but you are kind of missing the point if you're purposely skipping out. But another thing I would notice is people who are kind of watching to make sure they don't get paired up with somebody that they don't like, or people who would sit in specific groups to make sure they didn't end up with somebody who they had open conflict with. Which is always interesting to me, because the literal point of Jesus washing feet is to show that there is no place for conflict and unresolved issues in the church. So it always made an impact on me how we would practice actual foot washing, but not pursue the spirit of foot washing that Jesus was teaching. Jesus was teaching that we should serve each other. We should be loving each other and devoted to each other. And because of that, within the church context, there is not room for division and hurt and frustration. And a lot of times that's one of the main things that church is known for. So I think as a culture, as a church culture, we are missing the point there. And it always made me laugh that we would do foot washing, but we would not get along. The point was actually serve each other, not make sure you don't forget to put foot washing on your calendar. So I think because of how I grew up and what I've seen, I should say I still have a really deep appreciation for this. I do think it is a meaningful thing. But I think we had missed the point, and I think churches can easily miss the point that Jesus is saying, hey, stop being so concerned about who is the best and start serving each other out of love and grace and compassion. And you can't have that unless you pursue forgiveness and reconciliation. So it's really important in a church context. So he does this, he washes the feet, and when he's finished washing feet, Peter says that he will go anywhere Jesus goes, and Jesus confronts him by saying, well, you're definitely going to deny me. And Judas takes off to betray Jesus. So this whole issue with Judas is interesting too. Because Judas has been walking with Jesus, we can assume, at least 3 years, like the full length of his earthly ministry, and yet Judas is not a believer. And so Jesus has been spending a lot of time teaching. He's been spending a lot of time just doing kind of life-on-life accountability and mentorship with his disciples, and yet Judas refuses to believe and is conflicted in his relationship with Jesus. And Jesus knows this. So that's another compelling thing about Jesus. I don't know if you ever thought about that before. But Jesus knows that Judas is going to betray him. And yet he permits Judas to follow him around day in and day out. It's just a really interesting part of the story. The story does point out, the Gospels point out, that Satan is a part of it. In today's readings, we see that Satan is interested in testing Peter, and he wants to sift Peter, and so Jesus is praying for the defense of Peter. And we also see that Satan is moving Judas to betray Jesus. So I think this is one of those rare instances in the Bible. I think, like, obviously Satan is present at all times, but this is one of those unique instances where he is specifically called out as involved in the situation. And here he is obviously moving people away from Jesus rather than toward Jesus, which is definitely what he tends to do. So as far as your part for today, I just want to encourage you to serve each other. I really do hate it when we teach service. It's really easy to hear a story about Jesus washing feet or Jesus talking about it's not important who's the greatest. It's easy to agree with those stories, and it's also easy to just completely disobey them, not listen to them. And so as a church and as a people who are trying to follow Jesus, we have to actually take heart, and we have to actually be obedient to what Jesus is saying. So I would encourage you to pursue opportunities to be a servant. And Jesus is not talking about a one-off situation. He's not saying, hey, you should serve one time. He's talking about living a life of service and a life of humility. And so it's one thing to sign up to serve. It's another thing to actually be a humble person who is trying to reflect the will of God in all situations. And that's my encouragement to you. So we'll be back again tomorrow. Tomorrow we are focusing exclusively on a couple of chapters from John. So we'll see you then.
Thanks so much for listening to God's Plan, Your Part. If anything stuck out to you, if you have any questions, or if you'd like to receive a Bible, you can email us at godsplanyourpart@gmail.com. Also, if you're enjoying the podcast, please consider supporting us through the link in our description. We love that you're on this journey with us, and we hope you have a great day. See you tomorrow.